The air in the diner tasted like stale grease and burnt coffee. When the men in tailored wool walked in, the silence grew thicker than the cheap syrup. They spoke in harsh, clipped syllables nobody understood, until the exhausted waitress dropped her rag, sighed, and answered back, perfectly. The neon sign outside the window buzzed with a sound like a dying wasp. It cast a sickly, intermittent red glow across the cracked linoleum floor of the diner. Faye dragged a gray towel across booth number 3, pushing a cluster of hardened sugar crystals and a soggy napkin into her waiting palm. Her lower back throbbed. A dull, rhythmic ache radiated from her heels straight up her calves. Hour 14. She smelled like fryer oil and cheap industrial bleach, a scent she was certain had permanently embedded itself into her DNA. Behind the counter, Gary, the night manager, aggressively wiped down the espresso machine he never cleaned properly. Gary was a man entirely constructed of sweat and poor life choices, constantly chewing on a thoroughly mangled toothpick. Faye, Gary grunted, his voice a gravelly wheeze over the hiss of the grill. Somebody puked by the jukebox. Again. Faye didn't look up. She tossed the dirty napkin into a plastic tub. "I'm off in 12 minutes, Gary. Tell the new kid." "New kid quit an hour ago." Walked out the back door. Faye closed her eyes. The cheap diner coffee bubbling in the carafe behind her sounded like mud boiling in a sulfur pit. She was 27, chronically underslept, and running on a diet of stale sourdough and spite. She had exactly $18 in her checking account until Friday. She needed the shift pay. She didn't have the energy to argue. Before she could grab the mop, the front door swung open. The brass bell above the frame didn't just jingle. It clattered, violently pushed by the force of the wind and the heavy hand of the man entering. The storm outside had been threatening all night, a thick coastal deluge that turned the city streets into black mirrors. 3 men stepped over the threshold. The diner, which had previously held a comfortable, low-stakes murmur of drunk college students and tired truck drivers, instantly dropped in atmospheric pressure. It wasn't a sudden silence, but a gradual, suffocating dampening of sound. Silverware stopped clinking. A trucker in the corner booth slowly lowered his mug, staring straight at his plate. They didn't look like the usual 2 a.m. crowd. They wore suits. Not the cheap, off-the-rack polyester that the local real estate guys wore, but dark, heavy wool tailored so precisely it looked molded to their bodies. The man in the center took up all the oxygen in the room. His name, though Faye wouldn't know it until the police reports filed months later, was Victor. He didn't swagger. He didn't puff out his chest. He simply walked with the terrifying, unhurried grace of a man who owned the concrete beneath his expensive leather shoes. His hair was dark, damp from the rain, slicked back from a face that looked carved from pale, unyielding flint. There was a thin, jagged scar tracing the line of his jaw, disappearing into the collar of his white shirt. The 2 men flanking him were bulkier, their eyes darting, hands resting too casually near the lapels of their jackets. Victor stopped in the middle of the diner. He looked around. His expression didn't change, but his eyes, dark, flat and hollow, registered the cracked vinyl, the flickering neon, the smell of burnt meat. He looked violently out of place. "Oh, hell," Gary whispered, dropping his rag. The toothpick fell from his mouth. "Faye, go to the back. Go to the back right now." Faye froze, her hand still gripping the edge of the plastic bus tub. The instinct to run was loud, but the sheer, agonizing fatigue in her legs rooted her to the spot. She watched as Victor bypassed the wait to be seated sign and slid into booth 4, the one furthest from the windows, wrapped in the shadows. The red vinyl squeaked under his weight. His 2 shadows slid in opposite him. "Gary, who are they?" Faye murmured, her voice tight. "I don't know," Gary lied. The sweat on his forehead was sudden and heavy. "Just stay back here." But Victor raised a hand. He didn't snap his fingers. He didn't yell. He just raised 2 fingers in the air, a microscopic gesture of command. Gary swallowed hard, physically pushing Faye toward the floor. "Get their order. Don't look them in the eye. Just get the order and get back here." "I thought you just told me to go to the back," she hissed. "They're looking at you, Faye. Go. Now." Faye gripped her order pad. The cardboard backing dug into her palm. She wiped her hands on her stained apron, took a slow, rattling breath, and walked toward booth 4. Each step felt incredibly loud against the linoleum. As she approached, the smell of the diner faded, replaced entirely by the scent of the men. It was a jarring contrast: wet wool, ozone from the storm, a sharp peppermint tobacco, and something faintly metallic, like copper, like blood. She stopped at the edge of the table. "Welcome to the Silver Star," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the forced customer service cheer she usually wielded. "What can I get you?" Victor didn't look at her. He pulled a heavy silver lighter from his pocket and began turning it over his knuckles. A rhythmic, metallic clack, clack, clack. He stared out the rain-streaked window. The man across from him, a younger guy with a nervous tick in his left eye, looked up at Faye. "Coffee," he said in English, his accent thick and sharp. "Black. 3. Faye nodded, scribbling it down. "Anything to eat?" Victor spoke. The words were low, a guttural rumble in his chest. He didn't speak English. He spoke Japanese. It wasn't the polite textbook Japanese Faye had heard in the tourist districts of Kyoto. It was rough, heavily accented, laced with a brutal street slang that cut through the diner's dead air like a serrated knife. "Kitanai," Victor muttered, his gaze still fixed on the window. "Filthy. Konobasho wa hakike ga suru. This place makes me want to vomit." Faye's pen hovered over the cheap paper. Her heart did a strange, painful stutter in her chest. The syllables hit her ears, unlocking a dusty, tightly sealed box in the back of her brain. 4 years living in the cheapest, dampest apartments in Osaka, running from a father who drank his paycheck and a mother who pretended not to notice. 4 years of scrubbing floors in a ryokan, learning the language out of sheer, desperate survival before her visa expired and spat her back into the American Rust Belt. She stood perfectly still. The silver lighter went clack, clack, clack. Faye didn't react. The golden rule of the service industry, beaten into her over a decade of minimum wage hell, was simple. Swallow it. Swallow the insults. Swallow the pride. Swallow the exhaustion. She let her face remain a blank, uncomprehending mask. The younger man, the one who had ordered the coffee, leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Victor, swallowing hard. "Boss," he stammered, switching to Japanese. "We can't stay here long. The cops are circling the perimeter." Victor's eyes snapped away from the window. They locked onto the younger man. The silence that followed was suffocating. Victor didn't raise his voice, but the sudden stillness of his body was worse than a shout. "Did I ask for a situational report, Leo?" Victor asked softly in Japanese. The words were perfectly enunciated, dripping with a terrifying patience. Leo Faye guessed that was his name paled. He shrank back into the vinyl seat. "No, sir." "Then do not speak unless spoken to." Victor's gaze slid dismissively from Leo, finally landing on Faye. Faye stood there, order pad in hand, playing the dumb, deaf waitress. She shifted her weight, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in her right heel. She just wanted them to order so she could pour the coffee, wipe down the counter, and catch the 2:15 bus. If she missed it, she had to walk 3 miles in the freezing rain. Victor stared at her. His eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. They were the color of wet slate. He looked at her stained apron, her scuffed sneakers, the dark circles under her eyes. He assessed her in a fraction of a second and clearly found her utterly beneath his notice. He turned back to Leo. "Tell this useless cow to bring me tea. Green, boiling water. If it tastes like the garbage water they serve here, I'll burn the place to the foundation." Faye's jaw tightened. Her teeth ground together so hard she heard a faint popping sound in her ears. Useless cow. Leo looked at Faye, nervously licking his lips. He struggled to find the English words, his mind clearly scrambled by the sheer terror radiating from his boss. "He wants," Leo stammered, "tea. Green tea. Hot water. Very hot." Faye looked at Leo, then she looked down at Victor. The lighter continued its rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. "Just tea?" Faye asked in English, her voice entirely devoid of inflection. Victor caught the tone. His hand stopped moving. The lighter vanished into his palm. He looked up at her, a slow, dangerous tilt of his head. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the lack of deference. He understood defiance. "What is she looking at?" Victor murmured in Japanese, a dark amusement threading through his voice. "Does she want to lose those eyes? Tell her to fetch the water before I break her fingers." Leo whimpered, "Boss, please, let's just—" Something inside Faye snapped. It wasn't a heroic, cinematic moment of bravery. It was an ugly, brittle breaking point fueled by 14 hours of standing on hard linoleum, the smell of vomit near the jukebox, the lingering ache of a miserable life, and the absolute certainty that if she had to stand here for one more minute, her legs would simply give out. She was too tired to be afraid. Fear required energy. Faye only had apathy. She flipped her order pad closed with a sharp snap. She looked Victor dead in the eyes. Not at his forehead, not at his collar. Right into the slate-gray emptiness of his irises. "Ocha wa arimasen," Faye said. "We don't have green tea." The words dropped into the space between them like anvils. The diner went dead silent. Even the rain against the glass seemed to mute itself. Leo's jaw literally unhinged, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. The third man, who had been silently watching the door, whipped his head around so fast his neck popped. Victor froze. Faye didn't stop. Her accent wasn't the crisp, polished dialect of a Tokyo boardroom. It was the rough, slurred Kansai Ben of the Osaka working class. It was the language of tired fishermen, angry cooks, and exhausted maids. "Lipton no kaucha shika nai," she continued, her voice flat, tired, and dripping with profound annoyance. "We only have Lipton black tea. So shite, watashi no yubi o oru mae ni, kono mise no yuka o migaite moraeru, watashi wa mo tsukareta. And before you break my fingers, could you mop the floor of this place? I'm already exhausted." Leo made a sound like a strangled mouse. He looked from Faye to Victor, his face entirely drained of blood. Victor just stared at her. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The tension was a physical weight, pressing down on Faye's chest. A tiny, rational part of her brain suddenly screamed, "What did you just do? You just mocked a cartel boss in his own language." Her stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. She gripped the order pad so tightly her knuckles turned white. But Victor didn't reach for a gun. He didn't order his men to stand up. A strange, complex shadow passed over his face. The flat, dead emptiness in his eyes fractured, confusion, followed by a sharp, jarring spark of intense focus, flared in his gaze. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He noticed the callus on her thumb. He noticed the exact angle of her tense jaw. He noticed that her hands were shaking, but her chin was held stubbornly high. He slowly leaned forward, resting his forearms on the sticky table. The smell of copper and mint washed over her again. "Ome," Victor started, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You." Faye tapped her pen against her pad. "Look," she said, switching back to English, her voice cracking slightly, betraying her sudden spike in adrenaline. "Do you want the black tea or just the coffee? My bus leaves in 10 minutes, and I'm not missing it for you." The silence in booth 4 stretched until it felt like a physical wire pulled taut across Faye's throat. Leo looked like he was bracing for a gunshot. The third man shifted his weight, his leather holster squeaking faintly against his ribs. Faye kept her eyes on Victor. Her right foot throbbed, a dull, rhythmic burning in her arch. She dug her fingernails into the cardboard of her order pad, waiting for the violence she had just invited. Then, Victor did something worse than pull a gun. The corner of his mouth twitched. A sharp, rough sound scraped its way up his throat. It took Faye a second to realize it was a laugh. It was entirely devoid of humor, a dry, abrasive exhalation that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Lipton," Victor said. He didn't say it in Japanese. He spoke English. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, the syllables clipped and precise, carrying the faint, arrogant rhythm of a private European boarding school. It was a jarring contrast to the gutter slang he had just spat at Leo. "Lipton is fine," Victor repeated, leaning back against the red vinyl. The squeak of the seat sounded absurdly loud. He looked at her order pad, then back up to her face. "Make it 2." Leo suddenly looks like he needs something warm. Leo swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. Faye didn't nod. She didn't say right away, sir. She just turned on her heel and walked back to the counter. Her spine felt like it was made of stacked glass. She expected a hand to grab her collar, a heavy ceramic mug to hit the back of her head. Nothing happened. The physical effort of putting one foot in front of the other took all the remaining oxygen in her lungs. Behind the counter, Gary was practically hyperventilating. He had backed himself up against the grease-stained wall next to the fryers. "Are you insane?" Gary hissed, spit flying from his lips. "What did you say to them?" "Faye, I swear to God, if they shoot up my diner—" "They're not going to shoot up the diner, Gary," Faye muttered, her hands shaking as she grabbed two thick chipped porcelain mugs. "They want tea." She pulled the hot water spigot. It hissed violently, spitting scalding water and a cloud of mineral-smelling steam over her knuckles. She barely felt the burn. Her mind was a static loop of the slate-gray eyes and the smell of copper. She dropped two limp, yellow Lipton tea bags into the water. They floated pathetically to the top, bleeding a weak, muddy brown into the water. She put the mugs on a plastic tray. She didn't wipe the water that had spilled over the rims. Let him complain. When she returned to booth 4, the low murmur of Japanese stopped instantly. The three men were staring at her. Well, Leo and the guard were staring. Victor was simply watching. There was a difference. Faye set the tray down. She gripped the first mug and placed it in front of Leo. Then she reached for the second. As she set it down in front of Victor, the mug slipped slightly on the wet plastic tray. A splash of boiling brown water sloshed over the rim, landing directly on the cuff of his immaculate white shirt. Leo gasped. Faye froze. "This is it," she thought. "This is where I get hit." Victor didn't flinch. He looked down at the rapidly spreading brown stain on his expensive cuff. Then he slowly raised his eyes to Faye's hands. He wasn't looking at the spilled tea. He was looking at her knuckles, raw and pink from the industrial bleach. He was looking at the small, crescent-shaped burn scar on her wrist from the grill. "You speak Kansai Ben like a dock worker," Victor said softly, reverting to Japanese. His voice was a low, intimate rumble beneath the diner's ambient noise. Faye wiped the spilled water off the table with her rag. "I learned it from people who worked for a living," she replied in English, refusing to play his game anymore. "Drink your tea. I'm clocking out." She turned and walked away. She didn't look back when she pushed through the swinging doors into the back kitchen. She stripped off her apron, the stiff, sour-smelling fabric clinging to her damp shirt. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unknot the strings. She grabbed her coat, punched her time card into the rusted slot clack, and walked out the heavy steel back door into the alley. The rain hit her instantly, a freezing sideways sheet of water that soaked through her thin jacket in seconds. The alley smelled like rotting cabbage and wet asphalt. She started walking toward the bus stop, her boots splashing through deep, oily puddles. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow, nauseating exhaustion. She had just talked back to a man who wore blood like cologne, and she had survived. 15 minutes later, Gary found booth 4 empty. The tea was untouched, but sitting in the center of the table, perfectly weighted down by the metal napkin dispenser, was a crisp $100 bill. Underneath it was a single folded 10 to 1,000 yen note. The corner of the Japanese currency was stained with a dark, dried rust color. Blood. 3 days passed. The rain finally stopped, leaving the city under a thick, suffocating blanket of gray humidity. Faye's life returned to its miserable baseline. She slept in 4-hour bursts on a mattress that sagged in the middle, waking up to the sound of her upstairs neighbor violently coughing. She ate toast over the sink. She checked her bank account. $17.42. She had bought a cheap coffee on Tuesday, a rare moment of weakness she now bitterly regretted. She tried to push the men in the tailored suits out of her mind. She told herself they were just passing through. Transients in expensive wool. People like that didn't linger in this part of the city. On Thursday night, she walked into the diner for her 6 p.m. shift. The first thing she noticed was the smell. The usual underlying stench of burnt grease and sour milk was gone. The air smelled sharp, clean. It smelled like lemon ammonia and, faintly, like peppermint tobacco. The second thing she noticed was the silence. The diner was entirely empty. It was 6:15 on a Thursday. They should have had at least 4 booths of regulars, the retired mechanics, the college kids skipping evening lectures, but the tables were wiped bare, the jukebox was unplugged. The open sign in the window was flipped to closed. Gary was sitting on a stool near the register. He wasn't chewing his toothpick. He looked physically ill, his skin a clammy, translucent white. Both of his hands were resting on his knees, clutching a thick manila envelope. "Gary?" Faye asked, letting the door click shut behind her. The bell didn't ring. Someone had taped the clapper. "What's going on? Why are the doors locked?" "Faye," Gary croaked. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the linoleum floor. I'm sorry, Faye. I just run the place. I don't own the building." A cold, heavy stone dropped into the bottom of Faye's stomach. She turned her head. Sitting in booth 4, cloaked in the dimming evening light, was Victor. He wore a dark charcoal suit today, the jacket unbuttoned, revealing a black silk shirt underneath. The scar on his jaw looked harsher in the daylight. He was reading a thick, leather-bound notebook, turning the pages slowly. He didn't have his shadows with him. Leo was nowhere in sight. The third man was gone. It was just Victor, taking up the space of 10 men simply by breathing in it. He closed the notebook. The sound was like a gavel striking wood. "Sit," Victor said. English, perfect, clipped, and commanding. Faye stood frozen by the door. Her instinct was to turn the deadbolt, run out into the street, and never stop. But where would she go? Her apartment had a broken lock. Her bank account couldn't buy a bus ticket to the next county. The reality of her poverty chained her to the floor more effectively than iron shackles. She walked over to booth 4. She didn't sit. She stood at the edge of the table, crossing her arms tightly over her chest to hide the fact that her fingers were trembling. "The diner is closed," Faye said, her voice tight. "The diner was bought," Victor corrected calmly. He pushed a small ceramic cup toward the center of the table. It was steaming. Real, high-grade matcha. The smell of earthy green tea filled the space between them. 45 minutes ago. The previous owner was highly motivated to liquidate his assets. Faye stared at the tea. "Why?" Victor looked up. His slate eyes locked onto hers, dissecting her panic with a clinical, terrifying interest. "My translator," Victor began, his voice dropping into a low, conversational rhythm that felt incredibly dangerous, "is a coward. Leo speaks adequate English, but he filters. He softens the words because he is afraid of my temper. When the Italians tell me to go to hell, Leo tells me they respectfully decline." Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The proximity made Faye's chest tighten. She could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the tiny, violent tension in the muscles of his neck. "I cannot do business with a filter, Faye," he said. Hearing her name in his mouth felt like a violation. She hadn't given it to him. "I need someone who is too tired to lie to me," Victor continued. "Someone who looks at a loaded gun and only cares that it's keeping her from catching the 2:15 bus. You insulted me to my face in my own language because you were annoyed. That lack of self-preservation is rare. I find it useful." "I'm a waitress," Faye snapped, her voice cracking. "I pour coffee. I don't work for the cartel." "You don't work for anyone right now," Victor replied softly, "because I just fired the entire staff of this establishment, except you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thin, sleek black phone. He slid it across the table until it touched the edge of the ceramic teacup. "Tomorrow night, 9 p.m., Victor said. He stood up. He was at least 6'2", towering over her. The scent of ozone and mint enveloped her completely. "A car will be outside your apartment. The lock on your front door is rusted through, by the way. You should have that fixed. Or, rather, I will have it fixed." Faye couldn't breathe. Her lungs felt like they were filled with wet sand. He wasn't asking. He had stripped away her job, her space, her illusion of safety, all within an hour. "And if I don't get in the car?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Victor paused. He looked down at her, the flat emptiness returning to his eyes, a terrifying void where human empathy should be. "Then I will come upstairs and help you with your coat." He walked past her, his shoulder brushing heavily against hers. The brass bell on the front door stayed silent as he pushed it open, stepping out into the gray dusk, leaving Faye alone with the smell of matcha and the ruin of her ordinary life. Faye's ordinary life just shattered, and the pieces belonged to a man who doesn't take no for an answer. Victor didn't just corner her, he bought her entire world to force her into his. The line between employee and captive is blurring fast. Will Faye survive the criminal underworld? Or will Victor's dark obsession drag her under? If you're hooked on this intense, slow burn tension, like this video, share it, and hit subscribe so you don't miss part 5. Tell us below, would you get in Victor's car?